Okay, so when we talk about this risk of crime, right? There's something that is happening or is not happening that is maybe a bit more subtle than that we're really picking on. So we're going to unpack that a little bit. So keep in mind that when we think about this crime threat that occurs as a risk of depolicing, there's not a lot of information about it, right? It's simply crime may go up, right? So there's no specification of the type of crime or the duration of like an increase. There is no talk about type, duration, the direction. Typically they couch it in terms of crime will increase, right? But if there's going to be an impact on crime, that could also be negative, right? And maybe that's a good thing, right? But there's nothing related to that. You also have to consider that there isn't really any information on the degree. So if there is going to be an increase in crime, is that a small thing? Is it a large thing, right? Now, depending on how big of an effect that is, or what direction, or how strong and for how long, that could likely change your opinion about whether or not it's worth it to engage in police reform. This kind of discussion, though, does not, especially if it's like violent crime, right? Which I imagine more people are going to be scared of that than property crime or just like prostitution, right? So if you keep it vague, it's really hard to get anything that's going to be worth it against you, right? So when we see stuff like that, these are important questions to consider because they could, very well affect public opinion about an issue. So these are the kinds of questions you should be asking yourself then when we consider, police reform issues about related to that, right? So these are all important things to consider when we're thinking about should we actually endorse police reform if there's a risk of crime. These are just think about these things, right? The other part to consider too is that if we are considering like depolicing effects and stuff like that, where officers are less engaged, does this actually happen in practice? So happen in practice, or is it simply a mental issue? Or at least a mindset that something is wrong, or police become less proactive or less engaged with their duties, and like what is the consequence of that? For example, right, it is known that in police departments that have targeted, right, officers are demoralized, right? I don't think anyone would say like, yeah, a lot of people think we're shitty and like we have aggressive encounters with the public and it makes me not want to do my job. Like that is a very real thing. One, like that people become confrontational with officers, or they have complaints about them. They're more likely to protest, to say derogatory things about police and so on, right? And to feel like you're part of like a bad kind of police department, or that other people don't get it. No one trusts you, and it's easy to internalize. Like that is a significant harm to the officer, right? So that can happen, right? The other part too is that with police reform, there are a lot of changes in policy and probably in admin as well. It's not uncommon for police chiefs or certain command line staff to be asked to leave or step down or fired or something like that. So what ends up happening is that all these changes are happening in terms of training, in terms of what police departments have to do, in terms of leadership, right? It can be hard to know what the correct policy is. So if it was changed, like what is the correct one that we have to do now? Correct policy, or the reason for changes, which people often want to know, right? If we're making this change, why is it being made? Otherwise, it's just like you're changing stuff without context, right? So that context is needed. And not everyone communicates that well, and that's really important in terms of police department. Or what the goal is, right? You may have officers who do not like the direction of a police department before the reform and then they choose to stay. And then you have others where the police department is changing. They don't like where the direction is going and then they leave, right? So there are consequences in terms of, officer morale. They could also experience burnout, which that'd be a good add-on to do, right? If officers lose self-efficacy in their jobs, this could be related to depolicing, where they experience burnout. What are the consequences of that? If they are disillusioned, to begin with, right? Even though that may not have an impact on crime or injuries to officers, which is what primarily the discussion's about, there could be harms related to this that we're just not aware of. So harms related to the change in police reform that we're not aware of, that have not been discovered yet, or they're manifested in other ways. Maybe that's a change in productivity because officers now have to document so much stuff, so it's a time suck kind of thing. Maybe it's a recruitment issue where you can't get new recruits, so there's a lot more pressure on older people to go in. It could be an issue where people don't have enough resources. They have mental health issues that they have to consider, right? So all these can manifest itself in other ways, right? But this often does not enter the public discussion in terms of the impact of police reform, right? So these would be all important areas to look at when discussing police reform writ large, right? Especially in this context of depolicing. So I think, but if we look at the evidence to date, more often than not, I believe that there is either no impact on crime, and I think that in most cases, there hasn't really been shown to be no or limited impact on police casualties writ large. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't, measurement issues. That doesn't mean that that this is the end-all, be-all. This doesn't mean that, these studies are even conducted correctly, right? But, this is a small and growing field, and I included it in this week's as a week of a topic of discussion, mainly because it's a new topic. It's affecting current police reform, and, it affects things that are currently going on, such as like when the federal government was considering passing a National Police Reform Act, right? All these issues are intertwined, especially when you consider things like the Black Lives Matter movement, when you consider things like the existing Section 14141, act that's in place. When people start having conversations about defunding police, like these are all interrelated issues that are related to depolicing. It's a contemporary issue. It's why I included it. I think it has a lot of opportunities for good discussion, so that's why it's here. But with that,